The sound of the big Detroit diesel was what Art Miller heard first. It wasn't the familiar, rhythmic chug of a farm engine, but the high, idling, air-brake hissing groan of a road hauler. He wiped a smear of grease from his brow with the back of his hand and squinted down the half-mile gravel lane that connected his farm to the county blacktop. A long, low-boy trailer, painted the vibrant green of new money, was turning in, its chrome grille flashing in the harsh May sun of 1974. On its back, lashed down with heavy yellow chains, sat not one, but two machines that made his heart sink into his worn-out work boots. They were John Deere's all right, but not like any he'd ever owned. These were 44-30s, their paint so glossy it looked wet. They had the new Soundguard cabs, futuristic bubbles of tinted glass and steel that looked more like something from a science fiction movie than a piece of farm equipment. They were massive, arrogant, and they represented everything Art had spent his 62 years fighting against: debt. He dropped the wrench he was holding onto the concrete floor of his shop. It clanged with a note of finality. He didn't have to ask who had done this. There was only one person with the gall, the ambition, and the complete disregard for the Miller family's cardinal rule. If you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. His son, Daniel. Art walked out of the cool dimness of the machine shed into the bright heat. The dust from the lane was already settling on his wife's petunias. He didn't hurry. He walked with the deliberate, ground-eating stride of a man who had covered these acres on foot his entire life. He reached the end of the lane just as the truck driver, a young man with a feathery mustache, was climbing down from his cab, clipboard in hand. "Miller Farm?" the driver asked, already smiling. He was used to being the bearer of good news, the Santa Claus of horsepower. "That's the name on the mailbox," Art said, his voice flat and hard as a blacksmith's anvil. He didn't look at the driver. His eyes were fixed on the tractors. He could smell the fresh paint over the scent of diesel exhaust. He saw the plastic still on the seats, the dealership sticker gleaming on the side of the engine cowling. 225 horsepower combined. More than his entire fleet, and more debt than his father had seen in a lifetime of farming through the Great Depression. The farmhouse door slammed, and Danny came jogging out, a wide grin splitting his face. "They're here! Dad, they're finally here!" Danny was 30, filled with the restless energy of his generation. He saw the world in terms of expansion, efficiency, and leverage. To him, his father's two old tractors, a battle-scarred 1968 John Deere 40-20 and a rusty but reliable Farmall M, were relics. They were anchors holding them back while their neighbors were buying up land and equipment with bank money that seemed, in those heady days of booming grain prices, practically free. Danny's grin faltered when he saw his father's face. It was a thundercloud, dark and menacing. Art wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the driver. "You can turn that rig right around," Art said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "They're not staying here." The driver's smile vanished. He looked from the old man to the young one, confused. I've got a delivery order here, signed by Daniel Miller. 2 John Deere 44-30s. Paid the deposit and financed the rest through the dealer." "I don't give a damn what you've got," Art said, finally turning his gaze on his son. The look in his eyes made Danny take an involuntary step back. "You will not bring another man's property onto my land, and that's what those are. They belong to the bank, not to you, not to us." "Dad, be reasonable." Danny's voice cracked with a mix of anger and humiliation. "We talked about this. The 40-20 is worn out. We lose 3 days every time it rains because we can't get in the field fast enough. These tractors, they could have this whole farm planted in a week. We could pick up another quarter section. We get the crop in every year, Art stated, unmoved. And the 40/20 is ours. Every bolt, every tire, every drop of oil in that crankcase is paid for. Can you say the same about these? He gestured with his chin toward the gleaming green machines. You know what those are, son. They're $100,000 chain around your neck, and the day corn drops back to $1 a bushel. The banker holding the other end of that chain is going to give it a yank. Things are different now, Dad. The whole world is buying our grain. Prices are never going back down. You're stuck in the past, Danny pleaded, his voice rising. The truck driver was now trying to look busy, checking the tension on his chains, pretending he wasn't listening to the family drama unfolding at the end of the lane. The past is what I own. The past is what paid for this ground you're standing on, Art said, his voice dropping low again. My father didn't lose this farm in the 30s when everyone else was going under because he was a modern farmer. He lost it because he listened to a banker who told him the good times would never end. I bought it back with cash, sweat, and scrimping by with old iron nobody else wanted. I will not see that mistake made again. Not while I'm breathing. He turned back to the driver. Son, I'm not signing for anything, and your truck is not coming 1 inch further down this lane. You take those tractors back where they came from. Danny looked like he'd been struck. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had seen his father be stubborn, but this was something else. This was a line drawn in the dirt, a fundamental clash of two worlds. The world of caution, built on the hard-learned lessons of scarcity, and the new world of ambition, built on the seductive promise of endless credit. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the impatient rumble of the Detroit diesel. The future of the Miller farm was sitting on that trailer, and the past was standing in the lane, refusing to let it pass. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to stop and ask you all a question. Standing there at the end of that lane, with the old ways and the new ways staring each other down, who do you think was right? Was it Art, the old man holding fast to the principle of being debt-free, even if it meant less efficiency? Or was it Danny, the young buck trying to modernize and grow the farm, even if it meant taking on risk? Let me know what you would have done in that situation down in the comments below. I'm real curious to hear what you all think. The truck driver, seeing the old man's resolve, was as solid as the oak fence posts lining the lane, sighed and climbed back into his cab. He didn't want any part of this. With a hiss of air brakes and a groan of gears, the big rig began the awkward, multi-point process of turning around on the narrow county road. Danny watched, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, as the two gleaming green tractors that represented his future were slowly hauled away. He didn't say a word. He just turned and stalked back to the house, the screen door slamming behind him with the force of a gunshot. Art stood there until the truck was just a shimmer of heat and a faint diesel drone on the horizon. He felt no victory, only a deep, weary sadness. He had won the battle, but he feared he was losing his son. He turned and walked back to his shop, the familiar weight of the farm settling back onto his shoulders. They were already 2 weeks behind on planting, and now the tension in the house would be as thick as mud in the bottoms. The next morning, the silence at the breakfast table was absolute. Danny shoveled scrambled eggs into his mouth without looking up. Art's wife, Martha, moved between the stove and the table with a pained expression, her presence the only thing keeping the two men from open warfare. Finally, Art pushed his chair back. "Gonna need you on the disc," he said, not to Danny, but to the room in general. "I'll get the 40/20 on the planter. Danny said nothing. He just scraped his chair back a minute later and headed for the door. Art watched him go, then followed him out into the cool morning air. The 4020 was sitting where he'd left it, its faded green paint and rust-streaked rims a stark contrast to the memory of the machines from yesterday. It wasn't just a tractor, it was a testament to his entire philosophy. He'd bought it 10 years old from a neighbor who'd gone bankrupt. He'd torn it down to the frame himself, replacing bearings, seals, and wiring until he knew every inch of it, better than he knew the back of his own hand. Its diesel engine coughed to life with a familiar puff of black smoke, settling into a rough but steady idle. It was loud, it was uncomfortable, and it was his. He spent the morning in the open air, the roar of the 6-cylinder diesel in his ears, the smell of turned earth in his nostrils. He watched Danny in the far field, a small figure on the old Farmall M, pulling the disc harrow back and forth, kicking up a cloud of dust. They worked like that for 3 days, 2 solitary figures carving up the landscape, never close enough to speak. The breakdown happened on the 4th day. Art was making a pass along the western fence line, the planter dropping seed corn into the dark, rich soil. He was just about to lift the implement to make his turn when he felt a lurch. The tractor's forward motion stopped, but the engine was still running, its RPMs unchanged. He pushed the clutch pedal to the floor. It felt wrong, spongy. There was no resistance. He tried to put the synchro-range transmission into another gear. Nothing. Just a faint, sickening, grinding sound from somewhere deep inside the tractor's belly. He shut the engine off. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of sparrows on the fence wire. He knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent a lifetime listening to the language of machinery, exactly what had happened. The clutch was gone. Not just worn out, but catastrophically failed. He climbed down from the seat, his knees aching. He could see Danny on the other side of the field, stopped, watching him. This was it. This was the moment his son had been waiting for. The ultimate "I told you so." It took them the rest of the day to drag the dead 4020 back to the shop, using the underpowered Farmall M and a heavy chain. Danny didn't say a word, but his simmering resentment was so palpable Art could almost smell it. "Pressure plate must have let go," Art grunted as they unhooked the chain in the shop. "Imagine that," Danny said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "An old, worn-out part on an old, worn-out tractor. What are the odds?" "It can be fixed," Art said, ignoring the jibe. "Fixed? Dad, it's the middle of May. We've still got 200 acres to plant. By the time you get this thing torn apart and find parts for it, we'll be planting in June. Do you know what that does to our yield?" "We'll get it done," Art said, his jaw tight. The next morning, the real work began. Splitting a tractor of that size was no small feat. Art rolled the heavy-duty floor jack under the transmission housing and placed wooden blocks for support. He and Danny worked in strained silence, draining the 30 gallons of high-guard hydraulic fluid, the shop filling with its distinctive oily smell. They disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness, the power steering hoses. Every bolt was a battle, rusted tight from years of work and weather. Art put a long pipe on the end of a 3/4-inch drive breaker bar, his aging muscles straining to break the mainframe bolts loose. They came free with a crack that echoed like a rifle shot in the steel building. Slowly, painstakingly, they rolled the front half of the tractor, engine, front axle and all, away from the rear half. The exposed flywheel and the mangled clutch assembly told the story. 3 of the fingers on the pressure plate had snapped clean off, scoring the flywheel and shredding the clutch disc. It was a mess. "Well, there's your problem," Danny said, unable to hide the bitter satisfaction in his voice. Now what? Call the dealer. I'm sure they've got a 1968 pressure plate just sitting on the shelf, right next to the parts for the Model T. I'll call Miller's Salvage over in the next county, Art said, wiping his hands on a rag. He'll have one. He spent an hour on the party line phone, waiting for it to be free, then another 20 minutes describing the exact part he needed to Old Man Miller, no relation, who ran the salvage yard. Yep, got one, the voice crackled over the line. Pulled it off a 4020 that burned up last year. Clutch housing was fine. I can have it for you day after tomorrow. $60. $60. Art felt a small measure of relief. A new clutch assembly for one of the 4430s would have cost 10 times that, maybe more. But that was 2 days lost. 2 more days of perfect planting weather wasted. While they waited for the part, the whispers started. Silas Blackwood, their neighbor to the north, drove by slowly in his brand-new 4-wheel drive Steiger, the enclosed cab a cool oasis as he tilled his fields. He didn't wave. He just looked at the dissected 4020 in Art's shop and shook his head. When Art went into town for supplies, the old-timers at the co-op fell silent when he walked in. He could feel their judgment, a mixture of pity and scorn. Stubborn old fool, their eyes said, holding that boy of his back. Danny felt it even worse. At the feed store, young farmers his own age clapped him on the back. Heard you had some bad luck, Danny, one said, not unkindly. My dad's the same way. Thinks a new coat of paint is a waste of money. The words were meant as commiseration, but they felt like acid, reinforcing his own sense of frustration and helplessness. He was a partner in this farm, yet he had no say. He was tied to his father's antiquated beliefs, and now they were paying the price, becoming a laughingstock in the county. The part arrived on a Thursday. It was used, caked in grime and a little rust, but it was solid. Art spent hours cleaning it, checking the springs, making sure it was true. He and Danny wrestled the heavy new assembly into place, a frustrating, finger-pinching job that tested their already frayed patience. Finally, after another full day of work, the 4020 was whole again. Art turned the key. The engine fired, and when he pressed the clutch, it felt firm and right. He put it in gear, and the tractor eased forward. They had lost nearly 5 days. 5 prime planting days they would never get back. As Art drove the repaired tractor back out to the field, he knew he'd fixed the machine, but he had no idea how to fix the rift that had opened between him and his son, a gap that now seemed as wide and deep as the fields they were struggling to plant. Despite the breakdown and the lost time, they got the crop in. They worked from sunup until long after sundown, the headlights of the 2 old tractors cutting lonely paths through the darkness. The spring rains held off just long enough. It was a gamble, planting that late, but it was the only choice they had. And then a funny thing happened. The weather turned perfect. Gentle rains in June, hot, sunny days in July, and another good soaking in August. The corn shot up, dark green and healthy. By early autumn, it was clear they were looking at a bumper crop. Not only that, but the markets went insane. A massive, unexpected grain sale to the Soviet Union had sent prices skyrocketing. Corn, which had been hovering around $1.50 a bushel for years, suddenly shot past $3 and was still climbing. They harvested the best crop the Miller farm had ever produced, and they sold it at the highest prices in living memory. When the final checks came in from the grain elevator, the numbers were staggering. It was more money than Art had ever seen in 1 year. It was a windfall, a blessing from heaven. But for Danny, it was something else, entirely. A bitter vindication. One evening, after the books were settled, He laid it all out on the kitchen table for his father. "Look at this," he said, his finger tapping the ledger. "We did well. Better than ever. But look at Silas Blackwood's numbers. I talked to his son. They planted 300 more acres than us. They got it all in on time because they had the equipment. They made almost double what we did." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "Don't you see, Dad? This is what I was talking about. We got lucky this year. But that luck, combined with those new tractors, we could have bought the Henderson place when it came up for sale. We could be farming 1,000 acres right now instead of 600. "We're debt-free, Daniel," Art said calmly, though he could feel his stomach tightening. "Silas Blackwood owes the bank for that Steiger, for the new planter, and for that extra 300 acres. He's paying interest on all of it. It's good debt, it's leverage. You have to spend money to make money," Danny shot back, his voice rising again. Before Art could argue, Danny slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a purchase agreement. "I did it," he said, a note of defiance in his voice. "The old Johnson place. The 80 acres bordering our south field. I bought it." Art looked at the paper, then at his son. "With what money?" "My share of the profits for a down payment. The bank was happy to give me a loan for the rest. Land values are going up 15% a year, Dad. It's a guaranteed investment." Art felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It was the same logic, the same easy talk of guaranteed investments that he'd heard his own father recite 60 years ago, right before the world fell apart. "What's the interest rate on that loan?" he asked quietly. 6%, Danny said proudly. "It's nothing. We'll make that back in the first year's crop." Art didn't want to fight anymore. He was too tired. He just nodded slowly. "It's your money, son. Your debt." For the next couple of years, it seemed like Danny was right. The boom continued. Grain prices stayed high, land values kept climbing, and the weather cooperated. Danny, unable to convince his father to buy new equipment for the main farm, used his profits to buy a new to him International Harvester 1066 and the necessary tillage equipment to work his new 80 acres himself. He was stretched thin, but he was making it work, and his small piece of land was turning a good profit. He felt proud, independent. Art, meanwhile, did the opposite. He took his share of the windfall profits and paid off the farm's last remaining operating note. He replaced the roof on the barn, put up a new grain leg and a drying bin, all paid for with cash. He put the rest into certificates of deposit at the bank, locking it away. In the coffee shop, he was seen as a dinosaur, a man who, given the opportunity of a lifetime, had chosen to bury his money in a hole instead of making it grow. Danny was the one they talked about, the young go-getter who was building an empire acre by acre. The peace on the Miller farm was fragile, an unspoken truce built on financial success. But Art couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He'd listened to the news on the radio at night. The reports were full of talk about inflation, an oil embargo by countries he'd never heard of, and something called the prime interest rate. He'd get his bank statements in the mail and see the interest rate on his savings CDs creep up from 5% to 7%, then to 9%. It was good for his savings, but he knew it was a double-edged sword. One day, Danny came into the shop, his face grim. He was holding a letter from the bank. "They're raising the rate on my land loan," he said, his voice tight. "It's a variable rate mortgage. They just bumped it to 10%. "They're allowed to do that," Art said, not looking up from the mower sickle he was sharpening. "But it's not fair. It cuts my whole profit margin to pieces." "The banker isn't your friend, Danny," Art said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "He's a businessman, and his business is getting more expensive." A shadow had fallen over the sun-drenched prosperity of the American heartland. Most farmers, caught up in the rush of expansion and the gleam of new equipment, were too busy to notice. But Art Miller noticed. He'd seen a shadow like this before. He knew that it was long, that it was cold, and that it was followed by a storm that would wash away everything that wasn't anchored down deep in the solid rock of ownership. He just prayed his son had built on something more than sand. The year 1980 began not with a bang, but with a whisper of wind. It was a hot, dry wind that came up out of the southwest in April and never seemed to stop. It leached the moisture from the topsoil, turning the freshly tilled fields into a fine brown powder. The corn, planted in hope, struggled to emerge, its tender shoots a pale, sickly yellow instead of the vibrant green of years past. By June, the whispers had become a roar. The sun was a merciless white disk in a hazy, cloudless sky. The ponds on the back 40 began to shrink, their edges cracking into intricate, geometric patterns of dried mud. The corn leaves curled in on themselves during the day, a desperate, thirsty prayer for a rain that never came. Danny felt the change first in his own 80 acres. The ground there was a bit lighter, less forgiving than the old Miller homestead. His corn was suffering badly. He ran his International 1066 day and night, pulling a cultivator through the rows, trying to break up the crust and conserve what little moisture was left. The tractor, with its enclosed cab and air conditioning, was a refuge from the blistering heat. But it couldn't create rain. It only burned fuel, the price of which was climbing every week, another consequence of turmoil in some far-away desert nation. Art watched from his open station 4020. He felt the sun beat on his neck and the hot wind chap his lips. He knew this weather. He'd seen it in the 50s, and he'd heard his father's stories of the 30s. This was a drought. Not just a dry spell, but a real, ground-cracking, crop-killing drought. He worked at a slower pace, tilling only when necessary, his old, paid-for equipment, sipping fuel compared to Danny's big International. He didn't have the illusion of being able to conquer the weather. He only hoped to endure it. The first real crack appeared in July. Danny was cultivating his south field when the 1066 gave a shudder and a loud whine. The hydraulics went dead. The cultivator sank into the hard ground, and the tractor coasted to a stop. He tried shifting the torque amplifier, the 2-speed power shift that gave the tractor its muscle. Nothing. He was stranded in a sea of withered corn. He spent 2 hours in the 100-degree heat with a toolbox, checking fluids and linkages. But it was no use. The problem was deep inside the transmission case, a place he had never been. He had to call the dealership in town. They sent a service truck, and the mechanic, a young man who looked like he'd never had grease under his fingernails, diagnosed the problem in 15 minutes. "TA's shot," he said, wiping his clean hands on a clean rag. "And it looks like it took the main hydraulic pump with it. We'll have to haul it to the shop. It's a big job." The bill came a week later. $2,400, more than Art had paid for the entire 4020 a decade earlier. Danny stared at the invoice, his stomach churning. It was money he didn't have. He'd have to get an extension on his operating loan, at an interest rate that was now a staggering 14%. Meanwhile, the empire of Silas Blackwood was beginning to show its own cracks. The giant Steiger, which had once seemed like the symbol of ultimate power, now looked like a monument to hubris. It couldn't make it rain either, but its thirst for diesel was insatiable. Art would see Silas's lights on at all hours, the big tractor crawling across the parched fields, its engine a constant, expensive drone in the night. One afternoon, Art saw Silas himself out on the road, pounding a for sale sign into the ground at the corner of a 40-acre pasture. It was marginal land, but it was the first piece Silas had ever sold. It was like watching a king pawn one of the lesser jewels from his crown. The men at the coffee shop stopped talking about Silas's new grain bins and started whispering about how much he must owe the bank. The tone wasn't envious anymore. It was nervous. The harvest that fall was a disaster. The corn that had survived was stunted, the ears small and poorly filled. Yields were down by more than half. It was a catastrophe, but it was about to get worse. Just as farmers started bringing their meager crops to the elevator, the bottom fell out of the market. The president had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The massive export market that had fueled the boom years vanished overnight. Corn prices plunged from over $3 a bushel back down to less than $2. Farmers were now trying to pay off loans taken out in an era of prosperity, with the income from an era of sudden, brutal poverty. It was a perfect storm, and it was just beginning. The winter of 1981 was cold and bleak, but the real chill came from the letters in the mailboxes. They were from the Federal Land Bank, from the local Production Credit Association, from the John Deere and Case IH finance divisions. They were polite, formal notices that the prime interest rate had been raised again, and again, and again. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, was cranking rates to levels never before seen in American history. 18%, 20%, 21%. For men like Silas Blackwood, who had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to expand, the letters were death sentences. His payments on the Steiger and his new land ballooned to an impossible size. He was paying more in interest every month than most farmers had made in a good year a decade earlier. For Danny, the letter about his 80 acres felt like a physical blow. His variable rate, once a manageable 6%, had climbed to 19%. His monthly payment had more than tripled, while the value of the crop he could grow on that land had been cut in half. He sat at the kitchen table, the letter shaking in his hand, his face pale. He had done everything the experts had told him to do. He had leveraged his assets, expanded his operation, and modernized his equipment. And now he was ruined. "I can't make the payment," he said to his father, his voice barely a whisper. "They'll take the land." Art sat across from him, sipping his coffee. He didn't say, "I told you so." The look of broken defeat on his son's face was more than enough. "We'll get by," Art said, his voice steady. "The main farm is clear. We don't owe anyone a dime. We'll tighten our belts." But tightening their belts couldn't save Danny's 80 acres. The foreclosure notice arrived in the spring. It was followed by a similar notice on his 1066 tractor. The dream he had built was being dismantled, piece by painful piece, by forces he couldn't control. The downfall of Silas Blackwood was more public, more spectacular. The auction was held on a bitter Saturday in March. Nearly every farmer in the county was there, not to bid, but to watch, to bear witness. They stood in clusters, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim, speaking in hushed tones. It could have been any one of them. The machinery was lined up in neat rows, gleaming in the weak sun, a testament to a fortune won and lost. The Steiger sat at the head of the line, immense and silent, its tires coated in the dust of the fields it would never plow again. Silas and his wife stood on the porch of their house, watching as the auctioneer sold off their life's work, piece by piece. The bids were insultingly low. Bankers with clipboards stood by, their faces impassive, calculating the losses. When the Steiger came up, a hush fell over the crowd. It had cost Silas over $100,000 just a few years before. The bidding was sluggish. It finally sold for $35,000 to an out-of-state syndicate that specialized in buying distressed assets. Art and Danny stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the tragedy unfold. Danny saw his own failure mirrored in Silas's public humiliation. He saw the new tractors, the big combines, the symbols of modern aggressive farming being sold for pennies on the dollar. And then he looked at his father. The old man's face was filled not with triumph, but with a profound sorrow. He was watching his neighbor, a man he had known his whole life, be utterly destroyed. When the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, Danny finally turned to his father. The wind whipped at their jackets. "You were right," he said, the words catching in his throat. "All this time, about the debt, about the risk. You were right. I was a fool." Art put a hand on his son's shoulder. It was the first time he'd done so in years. "You weren't a fool, son. You just believed the song they were singing. I'd just heard that tune before." They survived because they had nothing for the storm to take. While other farms were being liquidated, Art was in his shop, grinding valves on the old Farmall M. While bankers were repossessing brand-new equipment, Art was welding a cracked fender on the 4020. Their input costs were a fraction of their neighbors'. They burned less fuel. They had no repair bills from the dealership. They had no interest payments. They ate from Martha's garden and butchered their own hogs. They lived on the cash Art had saved, the money that was now earning an incredible 20% interest in a certificate of deposit. The very force that was destroying the community around them was, in a small way, helping them stay afloat. They were an island of solvency in a sea of red ink. The day before the bank was set to seize Danny's 80 acres, Art got up from the breakfast table and put on his good coat. He didn't say a word to anyone. He drove the old pickup into town and walked into the bank. He went to the desk of Mr. Henderson, the bank president, a man whose smile had grown tighter and his face more grey with each passing month. Art sat down. "I'm here about the Daniel Miller property," he said. "The 80 acres on the south line." Henderson shuffled some papers. "A regrettable situation, Art. We have a buyer, a corporate farming group from out of state. They're buying up a lot of distressed properties." "You don't have a buyer yet," Art said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not until the sheriff's sale. I'm here to pay the note, in full." Henderson looked stunned. "Art, the outstanding principal and the accrued interest. It's over $60,000. Art reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a passbook for his savings and a certificate of deposit. He slid them across the desk. "I believe you'll find there's more than enough in there. I want the deed, free and clear, in my name." An hour later, Art walked out of the bank, the folded deed in his pocket. He had just spent nearly every dollar he had saved, the nest egg he had so carefully built. But he had bought back his son's future. When he got home, he found Danny in the machine shed, staring at the empty space where his 10x66 used to be. The bank had taken it the day before. Art walked up and handed him the deed. Danny unfolded it, his eyes scanning the legal language. He looked up at his father, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tears welled in his eyes. "Dad? Why? This was all your money. You earned it." "My father lost this farm once," Art said, his voice thick with emotion. "I bought it back. I'll not be the man who presides over it being lost again. Not 1 acre. It's Miller land. It'll stay Miller land." He paused, then handed Danny a set of keys. They were the keys to the John Deere 4020. "Now, we've got a crop to get in. You're on the planter. I'll take the disc." That spring, something shifted in the county. The talk in the coffee shop was different. The men who had once quietly mocked Art Miller for his stubborn, old-fashioned ways now spoke his name with a kind of reverence. He was the one who had survived. He was the one who had seen it coming. Younger farmers, their dreams of expansion shattered, started showing up at his workshop. They'd ask his advice on how to repair an old clutch, or how to set the timing on a diesel engine, or just how to make it through another year. Art never turned anyone away. He shared his knowledge freely, knowing that a community was only as strong as its neighbors. A few weeks after Art bought back the land, Silas Blackwood showed up at the end of the lane. He was a changed man, stooped and thin. The arrogance burned out of him. He held his hat in his hands. "Art," he began, his voice raspy. I heard you're looking for some help this spring." Art looked at the man who had been his rival for decades. He saw not an enemy, but another farmer who had lost his way. "I could always use a good hand, Silas," Art said. "Pays not much, but it's honest work." And so, Silas Blackwood, the man who had once commanded a four-wheel drive Steiger from a climate-controlled cab, spent that spring driving Art's old, open-station Farmall M, the same dust and sun on his face that was on Art's. There was a humility in it, and in that humility, a kind of grace. Years passed. The farm economy slowly, painfully, recovered. Land prices stabilized, then began to creep up again. Art and Danny worked the farm together, now a true partnership built on mutual respect. Danny never again suggested buying a new tractor. When they needed more horsepower, they bought an old, well-maintained John Deere 46 or 20, and Danny learned from his father how to tear it down and rebuild it himself. He learned that the real value wasn't in the glossy paint, but in the knowledge of how to keep the iron running. He ran the farm with a new kind of wisdom, a blend of his own ambition and his father's hard-won caution. He expanded the Miller farm, but he did it slowly, paying cash for each new parcel, consolidating their holdings into one of the most respected and stable operations in the state. One warm autumn afternoon, nearly 30 years after that fateful day the truck had pulled in, Art, now well into his 80s, sat on an overturned bucket in the machine shed. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were clear. He watched as his grandson, a boy of 10, carefully helped Danny torque the head bolts on the 4020's engine. The tractor, scarred and faded, but mechanically perfect, was undergoing another one of its generational rebuilds. It had become more than a machine. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of their survival. Danny looked up and caught his father's eye. He smiled. "He's got a good feel for it, Dad." The boy looked over at his grandfather, his face smudged with grease. "Grandpa, why do we still keep this old tractor?" "Dad's new one has a computer in it." Art smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He motioned for the boy to come closer. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on his grandson's shoulder. "We keep it," Art said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "because it reminds us of the most important lesson you can ever learn out here. It's not about how much land you farm or how new your equipment is. It's about this." He gestured around the shop, at the tools hanging on the walls, at the tractor split in two, at the 3 generations of Miller men working together. It's about owning what you work, and never, ever letting what you work own you. This tractor doesn't own us. We own it. Every last bolt. Don't you ever forget that. The boy nodded, a serious look on his young face. He didn't fully understand the depth of the words. Not yet. But he would. He would hear the story, again and again, of the 2 new tractors that were sent away, of the drought and the crash that followed, and of the stubborn old man whose wisdom had saved them all. He would learn that the rumble of the old 4020's engine was the sound of their family's heart, a steady, reliable beat that had carried them through the storm, and would carry them long into the future.